The inspection team leader froze mid-step, his hand still resting on the twisted aluminum of the bomber's fuselage. What he saw inside the gun turret made his throat tighten not from fear, but from the sudden, sickening realization that everything they'd been told about American bomber defenses was catastrophically wrong. The .50 caliber barrel protruding from the remote-controlled sphere wasn't just large, it was part of a weapons system so sophisticated, so thoroughly engineered for maximum lethality, that the young lieutenant understood in that instant why so many of his fellow pilots never came back from their intercept missions. This wasn't a bomber. This was a flying fortress that could see in all directions, shoot in all directions, and kill from angles Japanese fighters had assumed were safe approaches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The date was the 24th of November, 1944, and the wreckage of the B-29 superfortress lay scattered across a field near Omura, on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. The bomber had been part of the 73rd Bombardment Wing's third mission against the Nakajima aircraft plant outside Tokyo, a raid that marked the beginning of the systematic destruction of Japan's industrial capacity. But this particular B-29 never made it home. Crippled by a combination of engine failure and fighter attacks during the return leg of the mission, the massive aircraft had struggled across 600 miles of open ocean before its pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Essig, made the decision to ditch near the Japanese coast rather than risk the lives of his crew over deeper water. 9 of the 11 crew members survived the controlled crash. Within hours, Japanese military police had secured the site, and by the following morning, technical intelligence officers from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service were conducting the most important aircraft examination of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Takeo Yoshikawa had been summoned from his post at the Fukuoka airfield, specifically because of his engineering background. Before the war, he'd studied mechanical engineering at Kyoto Imperial University and had spent 2 years working for Mitsubishi on propeller design. Now, at 26, he found himself standing before a machine that represented a technological leap so profound that he struggled to process its implications. The B-29 wasn't simply a larger version of the B-17 flying fortresses that had been bombing Germany. It was an entirely new category of weapon, a strategic bomber designed from the first blueprint to operate at altitudes, speeds, and ranges that made conventional fighter interception almost impossibly difficult. The sheer size of the aircraft was overwhelming. Even broken and partially submerged in the muddy field, the superfortress measured 99 feet in length, with a wingspan of 141 feet. The 4 Wright R-3000-350 Cyclone engines, each capable of producing 2,200 horsepower, were larger than the entire power plant of most Japanese fighters. But what truly captured Yoshikawa's attention, what made his hands tremble slightly as he climbed through the shattered waist section, was the defensive armament system. He'd been briefed, of course, on reports from pilots who'd engaged the new American bombers. They'd described devastating firepower, guns that seemed to track their approach with unnatural precision, overlapping fields of fire that made the standard tail-chase attack suicidal. But hearing about it in a briefing room and seeing the actual hardware were 2 entirely different experiences. The central fire control system was located in a pressurized compartment behind the cockpit. Yoshikawa studied it with the intensity of a surgeon examining a particularly complex organ. The system consisted of a central computer, an analog, mechanical calculator that used electrical relays and servo motors to automatically adjust aim based on target range, altitude, airspeed, and even temperature. 5 separate gunner stations were connected to this central brain through a web of cables and hydraulic lines. Each gunner operated a computing gun sight that displayed a reticle adjusted automatically for lead angle and bullet drop. The gunner simply placed the reticle on the target and pressed the firing trigger. The computer did everything else, coordinating the movement of the turrets and calculating the precise trajectory needed to put .50 caliber rounds into a fighter moving at 300 miles per hour. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, Back to the story. But the sophistication of the fire control system was only part of the story. The real revolution was in the turret design itself. Yoshikawa crawled into the upper, forward turret, or what remained of it after the crash. The twin, 50-caliber Browning machine guns were mounted in a streamlined plexiglass sphere that rotated on a bearing ring driven by electric motors. The entire assembly could traverse 360 degrees horizontally and 90 degrees vertically, allowing the gunner to track targets through almost any angle of approach. More importantly, the turret was remotely operated. The gunner sat inside the pressurized crew compartment, looking through a periscopic sight, completely protected from the -50-degree temperatures and thin atmosphere at 30,000 feet. Japanese fighters, by contrast, had no pressurization, no heated cockpits, and no oxygen systems capable of sustained operation above 25,000 feet. American bomber crews flew in shirt sleeves at altitudes where Japanese pilots struggled to maintain consciousness. The ammunition system was equally impressive. Each gun position was fed by a belt system that drew from ammunition boxes holding 500 rounds per gun. The upper forward turret alone carried 1,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition, enough for sustained firing for more than a minute, an eternity in air combat. The rounds themselves were a revelation. Yoshikawa examined the ammunition boxes and found a carefully engineered mix of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, tracer rounds for aiming adjustment, and standard ball ammunition. The armor-piercing rounds used a tungsten carbide core capable of penetrating the light armor of Japanese fighters at ranges up to 800 yards. The incendiary component ensured that even a glancing hit could ignite fuel tanks or hydraulic lines. As he moved through the wreckage, documenting each system with photographs and detailed sketches, Yoshikawa began to understand why the B-29 raids had been so devastating despite the relatively small number of aircraft involved. The Tokyo raid on November 24 had included only 70 B-29 seconds, a tiny fraction of the 1,000 bomber raids that were pummeling German cities. Yet those 70 aircraft had inflicted significant damage on the Nakajima plant and had shot down at least 7 Japanese fighters, while losing only 2 bombers to all causes. The loss ratio was unsustainable from the Japanese perspective. If the Americans could continue operating at this rate, Japanese fighter strength would be exhausted within months, even without accounting for the chronic fuel shortages and training deficiencies that were already degrading pilot quality. The defensive armament wasn't the only technological marvel. Yoshikawa spent hours examining the pressurization system, which maintained cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet while the aircraft cruised at 32,000 feet. The system used engine-driven compressors to force air into the sealed crew compartments, with pressure relief valves preventing overpressurization. This single feature gave American crews an enormous advantage. Japanese pilots attempting to intercept at high altitude faced not only the physical limitations of unpressurized cockpits, but also the cognitive impairment that came with oxygen deprivation. Decision-making slowed, reaction times increased, and vision became tunneled and grey at the edges. Meanwhile, American crews breathed normally, communicated clearly, and operated their complex fire control systems with full mental capacity. The engines told another story of American industrial dominance. The Wright R-3350 was a masterpiece of engineering, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder precisely machined and balanced, the entire assembly capable of running for hundreds of hours between major overhauls. Japanese engines, even the best ones produced by Mitsubishi and Nakajima, were lucky to achieve 50 hours of reliable operation before requiring significant maintenance. The difference wasn't just in design, it was in manufacturing precision, in the quality of steel alloys, in the availability of rare metals like chromium and molybdenum that were critically short in Japan but abundant in America. The Americans could afford to build engines with tight tolerances and exotic materials. Japan was already substituting inferior metals and simplifying designs just to keep production moving. But perhaps the most demoralizing discovery was the bomb bay. Even empty and damaged, the cavernous space spoke to the B-29's primary purpose. The bay could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, more than twice the payload of a B-17, and delivered from altitudes and ranges that made the superfortress almost invulnerable to conventional defenses. Yoshikawa had read intelligence estimates suggesting that Boeing was producing 16 B-29 seconds per day at its Seattle and Wichita plants. 16 aircraft per day, each capable of hauling 10 tons of high explosives across 2,000 miles of ocean, each protected by a defensive system that made interception a near-suicidal mission for Japanese fighter pilots. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. The crew compartment revealed the human element of American technological superiority. The pilots' seats were heavily armored, with steel plates protecting against attacks from below and behind. The instrument panel was comprehensive and clearly labeled, with every gauge, switch, and indicator positioned for maximum efficiency. There was even a relief tube for the pilots, a small detail that nonetheless spoke to the care taken in crew comfort during missions that could last 15 hours or more. Japanese bomber crews made do with far more primitive accommodations, and their missions were correspondingly shorter and less effective. Yoshikawa found the navigator's station particularly fascinating. The navigator worked at a small table, equipped with specialized instruments, maps, and a drift meter that calculated wind speed and direction by tracking ground features below. The precision navigation equipment allowed B-29 formations to find their targets despite flying above the cloud layer, where visual navigation was impossible. Japanese bombers relied primarily on visual navigation and were often forced to abort missions when clouds obscured their targets. The Americans simply flew above the weather and used their sophisticated instruments to bomb through the overcast. The radio equipment occupied a separate station and included multiple transmitters and receivers, allowing the crew to maintain contact with their base across thousands of miles of ocean. The communications system used high-frequency radios with sufficient power to reach Saipan from anywhere over Japan, plus shorter-range VHF radios for formation communication. Japanese aircraft had far simpler radio equipment, often just a single receiver with no transmitter at all in fighter aircraft. The communications gap meant that Japanese defensive coordination was primitive and slow, while American formations could adjust their tactics in real time based on radio coordination with other bombers and with long-range fighter escorts. As the examination continued into the second day, Yoshikawa compiled his findings into a preliminary report. The document made for grim reading. The B-29 represented not just an incremental improvement in bomber design, but a fundamental shift in the nature of strategic air warfare. The aircraft combined altitude performance that exceeded Japanese fighter capabilities, defensive armament that made conventional attack profiles suicidal, navigation and bombing equipment that enabled all-weather operations, and payload capacity sufficient to devastate Japanese industrial targets. Most critically, the superfortress could operate from bases beyond the range of Japanese retaliation. The Americans were building airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam Islands in the Mariana Chain that had fallen to American forces in the summer of 1944. From these bases, B-29 seconds could reach any target in Japan, while Japanese bombers lacked the range to strike back at the American bases. The defensive armament system alone changed the entire calculus of fighter interception. Traditional tactics called for fighters to approach from the rear and slightly below, exploiting the blind spot beneath the bomber's tail and attacking the engines and fuel tanks. But the B-29 had no blind spots. The upper aft turret covered the entire rear hemisphere, while the lower aft turret protected the belly. The tail gunner position, unique to the B-29 and absent from earlier American bombers, provided overlapping coverage with both rear turrets, creating a zone of fire so dense that attacking from behind was effectively impossible without accepting catastrophic casualties. Japanese pilots had attempted to adapt by attacking from head-on, diving through the formation from above, or making high-speed passes from the beam. Every approach proved deadly. The forward turrets, both upper and lower, provided excellent frontal protection, with each mounting twin 50 caliber guns. Beam attacks exposed the fighters to fire from multiple turrets on adjacent aircraft in the formation, and the relative closure speed was so high that even experienced pilots had only a second or two of firing opportunity before they flashed past their target. High-speed diving attacks from above gave pilots slightly better chances, but the upper turrets tracked remarkably well even against fast-moving targets, and the diving fighter had to pull out of its attack, run quickly, or risk overshooting into the guns of bombers lower in the formation. Yoshikawa's report included detailed drawings of the fire control system, measurements of turret traverse speeds and gun elevation limits, and careful notes on ammunition capacity and rate of fire. He estimated that a single B-29 could put roughly 6,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition into the air during a sustained engagement, enough to saturate the airspace around the bomber with a wall of lead and tracer fire. A formation of 7 aircraft flying in a standard combat box could coordinate their fire to create overlapping defensive zones where a fighter attacking any single bomber faced fire from 4 or 5 other aircraft. The defensive network was so effective that German fighter pilots attacking B-17 formations over Europe had coined a phrase for it, the box of death. Japanese pilots were learning the same lesson over Japan, but with even less favorable odds. German fighters at least had the advantage of operating over friendly territory, with short flight times to target and ample opportunities for pilots to bail out and return to action. Japanese fighters had to fly long distances to intercept raids, often engaging at altitudes where their engines barely functioned, and pilots who bailed out over the ocean had virtually no chance of rescue. The technical intelligence gathered from the downed B-29 circulated quickly through Japanese military and government circles. Senior officers read Yoshikawa's report with varying degrees of denial and despair. Some argued that the findings were exaggerated, that one crashed bomber couldn't be representative of the entire American fleet, that Japanese fighters would develop effective tactics given time and experience. But the more realistic commanders understood the truth. The B-29 wasn't just a superior weapon. It was proof of an industrial and technological gap that could never be closed through superior fighting spirit or tactical innovation. The Americans were producing thousands of these aircraft at factories so productive that they generated more aviation tonnage in a month than Japan's entire aircraft industry managed in a year. Every B-29 was crewed by men who'd received hundreds of hours of training in multi-engine bombers, using equipment and tactics refined through years of combat over Europe. Every aircraft carried tons of bombs manufactured at munitions plants that operated without fear of enemy attack, using raw materials imported from every corner of the globe. Japanese fighter pilots, meanwhile, were receiving less and less training as fuel shortages worsened, and experienced instructors died in combat faster than they could be replaced. New pilots were entering combat with as few as 40 hours of total flight time, barely enough to master basic flight controls, let alone the complex tactics needed to survive against B-29 formations. The aircraft they flew were increasingly cobbled together from inferior materials, with engines that failed regularly and weapons that jammed frequently. The disparity was widening with every passing month, and the examination of the downed superfortress had simply made the reality impossible to ignore. Yoshikawa finished his report on November 27 and submitted it through channels to the Air Technical Research Institute in Tokyo. He included a final paragraph that would be censored from the version distributed to field units, but which captured the essential truth of what he'd discovered. The B-29 superfortress represents a level of industrial and technological development that the Empire cannot match with existing resources. No modification to current fighter tactics or armament will reduce bomber losses to acceptable levels. The only effective defense against this weapon system would require fighters with substantially improved high-altitude performance, radar-directed fire control, and heavy-caliber cannon capable of engaging from beyond the range of defensive guns. The development and production of such aircraft is likely beyond our current industrial capacity. Absent a fundamental change in the strategic situation, the B-29 will be able to systematically destroy Japanese industry with losses we cannot prevent. The report was read, filed, and quietly suppressed. Admitting the technological inferiority it documented would have been tantamount to acknowledging that the war was already lost. Instead, official statements continued to emphasize fighting spirit, tactical innovations, and the development of special attack methods kamikazes that might overcome American technological advantages through sheer determination and sacrifice. The censored truth was that examining the downed B-29 had revealed not just a superior weapon, but a glimpse into an entirely different kind of warfare, one where industrial capacity and technological sophistication mattered far more than courage or skill. Japanese pilots had been shocked not by a single capability they couldn't match, but by a complete weapon system they couldn't even comprehend building. The bomber lying wrecked in that field wasn't just untouchable. It was proof that the Pacific War had become unwinnable. The reality of what Japanese pilots faced became brutally clear on the 3rd of December 1944, when Captain Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter aces with over 60 confirmed victories, led a formation of 12 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to intercept a B-29 raid over the Musashino aircraft plant in northwestern Tokyo. Sakai had survived 3 years of combat across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Guadalcanal to the desperate defense of Rabaul. He'd shot down P-42s, P-39s, F-4F Wildcats, and even the newer F-6F Hellcats. He understood air combat as well as any man alive, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what happened when he closed within range of the American bomber formation. The mission briefing had emphasized altitude and speed. Intelligence officers stressed that the B-29 seconds would be flying at 30,000 feet or higher, approaching at speeds around 230 miles per hour. Sakai's Zeros would need to climb to intercept altitude quickly, make their attack passes without hesitation, and break away before the bomber gunners could track effectively. The plan was sound, in theory. In practice, it fell apart within the first 30 seconds of engagement. Sakai's formation took 40 minutes to reach 30,000 feet, and when they arrived at altitude, every pilot was gasping for breath despite their oxygen masks. The Zero's oxygen system was primitive, a simple flow regulator that delivered pure oxygen but couldn't compensate for the physiological effects of extreme altitude. At 30,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is less than 1/3 of sea level pressure. The human body isn't designed to function in such conditions. Vision narrows, thoughts slow. Fingers become clumsy on the controls. Sakai felt like he was trying to fight underwater, every movement requiring conscious effort, every decision taking seconds longer than it should. The B-29 formation appeared as silver specks against the winter sky. 24 aircraft flying in 4-plane diamond formations staggered at different altitudes. They looked impossibly large, even at a distance of several miles, their polished aluminum surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. Sakai positioned his fighters for a frontal attack from slightly above, hoping to dive through the formation quickly enough to avoid the worst of the defensive fire. He checked his oxygen flow one more time, said a brief prayer, and pushed his stick forward into a shallow dive. The American gunners saw them coming from 5 miles away. The B-29's sophisticated radar could track fighters at ranges far beyond visual distance, giving gunners precious seconds to prepare. As Sakai's formation closed to 3 miles, the upper forward turrets in the lead bombers swiveled to track them. At 2 miles, the gunners placed their illuminated reticles on the approaching fighters. At 1 mile, roughly 10 seconds before firing range, the gunners squeezed their triggers. Sakai saw the tracers arcing toward him like strings of orange pearls, each tracer round representing 4 invisible bullets. The volume of fire was stunning. It wasn't the scattered defensive shooting he'd experienced from B-17 seconds or B-24 seconds over the Philippines. This was a coordinated barrage from multiple aircraft, the fire control computers synchronizing the turrets to create a wall of intersecting trajectories. Sakai jinked his Zero hard left, then right, trying to spoil the gunner's aim while maintaining his attack heading. 2 of his wingmen weren't as fortunate. Lieutenant Takahashi's fighter took a burst through the engine, cowling, and immediately began streaming white coolant vapor. He peeled away from the formation, his engine seizing. Ensign Watanabe's Zero simply exploded, hit by an incendiary round that detonated his nearly empty fuel tank. Sakai pressed his attack, closing to 400 yards before opening fire with his 20mm cannon and twin 7.7mm machine guns. He aimed for the lead bomber's cockpit, walking his tracers up the B-29's nose. His rounds sparked off the bomber's aluminum skin, and he thought for a moment he'd scored killing hits. Then the return. Fire intensified. The upper forward turret on his target tracked him perfectly, and suddenly his windscreen was starring with bullet impacts. A round punched through his canopy, missing his head by inches. Another hit his left wing root, tearing a jagged hole in the metal. The control stick went mushy in his hands as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. Sakai broke hard right and down, diving away from the formation, with his engines screaming and his airframe shuddering from battle damage. The entire engagement had lasted less than 20 seconds. Of the 12 Zeros that began the attack, 4 were destroyed, and 3 more, including Sakai's, were too badly damaged to continue fighting. The B-29 formation flew on, without a single aircraft lost, their bomb bays still full, their mission proceeding exactly as planned. Sakai nursed his crippled fighter back to Chofu Airfield and landed with half his control surfaces shot away. As he climbed out of the cockpit, his hands were still shaking. Not from fear, he'd been frightened plenty of times before, but from the realization that they were fighting an enemy who'd simply engineered away every tactical advantage Japanese pilots had relied upon. The problem wasn't courage or skill. Sakai's pilots were brave and experienced. The problem was that the B-29's defensive system had been designed specifically to defeat conventional fighter tactics, and it worked exactly as intended. The remote-controlled turrets eliminated the blind spots that fighters traditionally exploited. The computing gun sights compensated for range, deflection, and bullet drop automatically, turning average gunners into deadly marksmen. The overlapping fields of fire meant that attacking any bomber in the formation exposed the fighter to guns from multiple aircraft, and the 50 caliber Browning machine guns had enough range and hitting power to damage fighters at distances where the fighter's own weapons were ineffective. Japanese aircraft designers tried to respond. Kawasaki developed the Ki-102 heavy fighter, armed with a 57mm cannon designed to destroy bombers from beyond the range of defensive guns. Mitsubishi produced the J-2M Raiden interceptor with improved high-altitude performance and heavy armament. Nakajima rushed the Ki-84 Hayate into production, a fighter that could finally match American aircraft in speed and climb rate. But these new designs arrived too late and in too few numbers. By the time the first improved interceptors reached operational squadrons in early 1945, the B-29 campaign had already destroyed significant portions of Japan's aircraft industry, and the factories needed to produce interceptors in quantity were themselves being systematically demolished by the bombers they were meant to stop. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Japanese commanders. The examination of the downed B-29 inches November had revealed exactly what kind of aircraft would be needed to effectively counter the American bomber threat. But building such aircraft required the industrial capacity and raw materials that the B-29 raids were destroying faster than production could compensate. Every successful B-29 mission reduced Japan's ability to defend against the next mission. The strategic mathematics created a death spiral from which there was no escape. Individual stories of courage proliferated as the bombing campaign intensified. Lieutenant Kazuo Tsunoda developed a technique of attacking from directly above, diving vertically through formations and trying to destroy bombers with a single pass before they could track his fighter. He managed 3 successful kills using this method before his luck ran out on the 9th of January 1945, when defensive fire from multiple bombers caught his diving Zero and tore it apart. Flight Sergeant Yoshio Yoshino became known for pressing his attacks to point-blank range, sometimes closing to within 50 yards before opening fire. His devotion to duty earned him respect from fellow pilots and 2 confirmed B-29 kills, but also cost him his life when debris from an exploding bomber peppered his fighter and sent him spinning into the ocean. The statistics told the broader story. During December 1944, Japanese fighters engaged B-29 formations on 16 separate occasions. They destroyed 7 bombers, a victory rate of less than 1% against the aircraft dispatched, while losing 73 fighters and 59 pilots. The loss ratio was catastrophic and unsustainable. By January 1945, experienced pilots were so scarce that some fighter units were sending men into combat with less than 50 hours of total flight time. These barely trained pilots stood virtually no chance against the sophisticated defensive systems of the B-29 formations, and their losses accelerated the decline in overall pilot quality. The examination of the downed superfortress had also revealed something more psychologically devastating than mere technical superiority. The aircraft's construction quality spoke to an industrial system operating at a level of efficiency and sophistication that Japan could never hope to match. Every welded seam was perfect. Every rivet was precisely placed. Every component fit together with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The wiring harnesses were neatly bundled and labelled. The hydraulic lines were routed with obvious care to avoid chafing or stress points. Even small details like the seats, the instrument placards, and the tool storage compartments reflected a manufacturing philosophy where quality was never sacrificed for speed. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, showed increasing signs of manufacturing shortcuts and quality compromises. By late 1944, quality control had deteriorated so badly that new fighters sometimes arrived at operational units with missing parts, improperly installed components, or engines that failed within hours of first use. Skilled workers had been drafted into the military, killed in air raids. Factories operated with increasingly inexperienced labor forces that included students, elderly workers, and Korean and Chinese forced laborers who had little training and even less motivation to produce quality work. The aircraft that emerged from these compromised production lines were inferior copies of designs that had been marginal even when built properly. American crews, meanwhile, received training that was almost obscenely thorough by Japanese standards. B-29 gunners went through weeks of specialized schooling that included classroom instruction on the fire control system, simulator training, and live-fire exercises against towed targets. They learned to estimate range, calculate deflection angles, and coordinate their fire with other gunners in the crew. They practiced emergency procedures for gun malfunctions, turret hydraulic failures, and electrical system problems. By the time they flew their first combat mission, they'd fired thousands of practice rounds and could operate their weapons systems almost instinctively. Japanese gunners, when bombers carried them at all, received minimal training and often flew their first combat mission, never having fired their guns except during pre-flight checks. The difference extended to every aspect of operations. American bomber bases in the Marianas had concrete runways, permanent facilities, abundant spare parts, and maintenance crews trained to keep aircraft flying through thousands of hours of operations. Japanese airfields were often little more than grass strips with minimal maintenance facilities and chronic shortages of everything from replacement engines to lubricating oil. American aircrews ate hot meals before and after missions, slept in proper barracks, and had access to medical care and rest periods between operations. Japanese pilots often slept in tents, ate rice and pickled vegetables, and flew mission after mission without adequate rest because there were never enough pilots to maintain a proper rotation schedule. The psychological impact of facing the B-29 seconds gradually eroded Japanese fighter pilot morale in ways that pure combat losses never could. Pilots could accept death in battle. They'd been trained from the beginning to embrace sacrifice for the emperor and nation. What corroded their spirit was the growing realization that their sacrifice achieved nothing meaningful. A pilot could fly a perfect interception, execute his attack flawlessly, and still watch his cannon rounds bounce harmlessly off the B-29's heavy structure, while return fire shredded his lightweight fighter. He could survive one mission, only to face the same impossible odds the next day, and the day after that, with the certainty that eventually the statistics would claim him just as they'd claimed most of his training classmates. The December 27 mission against Tokyo illustrated the hopeless nature of the defense. 72 B-29 seconds struck the Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino, again dropping 453 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs from altitudes above 30,000 feet. Japanese fighters made determined attacks, and 5 bombers were damaged badly enough to ditch or crash land on return to base. But not a single B-29 was shot down over Japan, while Japanese fighter losses exceeded 90 aircraft. The Nakajima plant suffered extensive damage that would take months to repair, during which production of desperately needed fighters would halt completely. The bombing created a vicious circle where the weapons needed to defend against the bombers couldn't be built because the factories building them were being destroyed by the bombers. By early January 1945, senior Japanese commanders began seriously discussing the adoption of special attack tactics, deliberately crashing fighters into bombers as a last resort. The reasoning was brutally pragmatic. A conventional attack against a B-29 formation gave a trained pilot perhaps a 5% chance of destroying a bomber and maybe a 30% chance of surviving the mission. A deliberate ramming attack gave a near-certain chance of destroying the bomber at the cost of the pilot's certain death. The mathematics favored suicide tactics if the goal was simply to maximize bomber losses regardless of pilot casualties. The fact that such tactics were under serious consideration reflected how thoroughly conventional defense had failed. The examination of that single downed B-29 November had revealed the full dimensions of the problem, but it hadn't provided any solutions. Japanese engineers understood exactly why they were losing the air battle. They could measure the gap in engine power, calculate the disparity in defensive firepower, and quantify the difference in manufacturing quality. What they couldn't do was close those gaps quickly enough to matter. The industrial and technological advantages that made the B-29 possible had taken America years to develop and required resources that Japan simply didn't possess. The examination had been like a medical diagnosis, confirming terminal illness, accurate, detailed, and completely unhelpful in preventing the inevitable outcome. Captain Sakai, recovering from his injuries after the December 3 mission, read Yoshikawa's classified technical report in early January. The document circulated among senior pilots as a way to prepare them for what they would face. Sakai studied the diagrams of the fire control system, the specifications for the turrets, the calculations showing overlapping fields of fire. He read Yoshikawa's concluding assessment about the impossibility of effective defense given current resources. Then he closed the report, returned to his squadron, and continued flying interception missions against B-29 raids. Not because he believed they would succeed, not because he thought Japanese fighters could stop the bombing campaign. He flew because his pilots were flying, because the alternative was to abandon the people below to undefended destruction, and because sometimes the only response to impossible odds is to face them anyway. The final recognition of defeat came not in grand strategic pronouncements, but in small moments of private understanding. It came when a maintenance crew chief looked at the pristine manufacturing quality of a captured B-29 component and then looked at the shoddy Japanese-built replacement parts he was trying to install in his units, fighters. It came when a 20-year-old pilot with 40 hours of training climbed into his cockpit, knowing he was about to face gunners with hundreds of hours of practice and computer-assisted fire control. It came when Yoshikawa filed his report and realized that documenting the problem changed nothing because the solution was beyond Japan's capacity to implement. The examination of the downed B-29 hadn't revealed a weapon that was merely untouchable. It had revealed the face of industrial modernity, itself efficient, overwhelming, and utterly indifferent to courage, sacrifice, or fighting spirit. The Americans hadn't just built a better bomber, they'd built a machine that made traditional martial values irrelevant, and in doing so, they demonstrated that the war had been lost before the first B-29 ever flew over Japan. The transformation in Japanese defensive tactics during January and February 1945 reflected not adaptation but desperation. Major Tadashi Minobe, commanding the 302nd Naval Air Group at Atsugi, compiled combat reports from dozens of failed interceptions and reached a conclusion that contradicted everything in the fighter pilot's handbook. Conventional attacks weren't working because the B-29's defensive system had been engineered to defeat conventional attacks. The only way to reliably destroy a superfortress, Minobe concluded, was to remove the human element entirely from the equation. If pilots couldn't survive long enough to make multiple attack passes, then the first pass had to be the only pass, and it had to be absolutely lethal. Minobe's tactical innovation involved stripping his Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden interceptors down to minimum weight, removing 2 of the 4 20mm cannons and all armor plating, then loading the remaining guns with exclusively incendiary and explosive ammunition. His pilots would climb to altitude before the B-29 formations arrived, position themselves directly above the bomber stream, and make a single vertical diving attack at maximum speed. The dive would carry them through the formation so quickly that gunners would have only a fraction of a second to track and fire. The lack of armor meant any hits would be fatal, but Minobe calculated that the speed differential would reduce the probability of being hit to acceptable levels. The concentrated firepower of the remaining cannons, loaded entirely with high explosive rounds, could theoretically destroy a B-29's wing structure or engine with a short burst. The tactic achieved its first success on January 23, when Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi destroyed a B-29 over Tokyo, using Minobe's diving attack profile. Komachi's gun camera footage showed his tracers converging on the superfortress's left wing route for perhaps 2 seconds before he flashed past and pulled out of his dive. The B-29's wing folded upward at the root, and the massive bomber rolled inverted and fell away from the formation trailing burning fuel. It was a spectacular kill, and it proved that Minobe's theory could work. But it also illustrated the fundamental problem with the tactic. Komachi had needed perfect positioning, perfect timing, and perfect shooting during a 2-second firing window while diving at over 400 miles per hour. The margin for error was non-existent. Any hesitation, any slight miscalculation of deflection angle, any turbulence or equipment malfunction, and the attack would fail. Even when everything went right, the pilot got exactly one chance. If he missed, he'd used all his altitude and airspeed getting into position, and he couldn't climb back up for a second attempt before the bombers completed their mission and headed home. Minobe's unit destroyed 11 B-29 seconds during February using the diving attack tactic, but lost 27 pilots in the process, a loss ratio that would exhaust even a well-trained fighter group within weeks. The problem was replicability. Komachi was an exceptional pilot with over 1,000 hours of fighter time and superb marksmanship. Most of the pilots attempting the tactic were far less experienced, and for them, the split-second firing window proved impossible to exploit effectively. They'd dive through the formation, fire blindly, and pull out without knowing whether they'd hit anything. Gun camera analysis showed that more than 70% of diving attacks resulted in no hits at all on the target bomber. The pilots were risking their lives on attacks that usually accomplished nothing. The deeper issue was that tactical innovations couldn't overcome structural disadvantages in resources and industrial capacity. Even if Japanese pilots could maintain a favorable loss ratio, which they couldn't, the Americans could absorb losses that Japan could not. Boeing, Bell, and Martin were producing over 100 B-29 seconds per month by early 1945, with production accelerating. American training programs were graduating thousands of bomber crewmen every month, with instructor pipelines so robust that the quality of training actually improved as the war progressed. Japan, meanwhile, was losing irreplaceable pilots at unsustainable rates, while training replacements with increasingly inadequate instruction. The pilot who'd received a year of training in 1942 was infinitely more capable than the pilot receiving 6 weeks of instruction in 1945. Yet both were expected to face the same mission demands. The ground crews who maintained Japanese fighters understood the deteriorating situation more clearly than anyone. Sergeant Jiro Horikoshi had worked as a mechanic at the Yokota Air Base since 1942, and he'd watched the quality of incoming aircraft decline month by month. The Zeros and Hayates arriving in early 1945 were nominally the same models that had been delivered 2 years earlier, but the actual aircraft were shadows of their predecessors. Engine mounts cracked during routine operations, hydraulic systems leaked constantly, instruments failed or gave false readings. The problems weren't design flaws, they were manufacturing defects created by an industrial system, collapsing under the combined weight of bombing damage, resource shortages, and worker exhaustion. Horikoshi spent his days improvising repairs with inadequate tools and non-existent spare parts. A cracked engine mount that should have been replaced with a new casting would instead be welded and reinforced with scrap metal. A hydraulic pump that should have been swapped for a fresh unit would be disassembled, cleaned, and reinstalled with worn seals, because no replacements existed. Every repair was a temporary fix, a way to keep the aircraft flying for one more mission before the next inevitable failure. The Americans, Horikoshi knew from captured documents and intelligence reports, simply replaced broken components with new parts from enormous supply chains that stretched across the Pacific. Japanese mechanics replaced broken components with repaired parts that had already failed once and would likely fail again soon. The contrast between American and Japanese logistics became starkest when examining fuel quality. The B-29 seconds burned 100-octane aviation gasoline, refined to exacting specifications that ensured consistent performance and engine longevity. Japanese fighters by early 1945 were using fuel that barely qualified as 87-octane, often contaminated with water or sediment from inadequate storage facilities. The low-octane fuel reduced engine power output by 15 to 20% and increased the likelihood of detonation, premature ignition, that could destroy pistons and cylinder heads. Pilots learned to baby their throttles, advancing power smoothly and carefully to avoid the characteristic hammering sound that indicated destructive detonation. But gentle throttle management was impossible during combat, when survival often depended on immediate full power application. Engines failed regularly during high-stress combat maneuvers, not because of enemy damage, but because the fuel couldn't support the power demands being placed on already marginal engines. The human cost of the defensive campaign extended beyond pilot casualties. The B-29 raids were killing thousands of Japanese civilians with each major attack, and the fighter pilots tasked with stopping the raids lived with the knowledge that every failure meant more deaths on the ground. Flight Sergeant Isamu Sasaki flew 12 interception missions between December 1944 and February 1945, and he never successfully destroyed a B-29. He damaged several, put bullets into bombers that might have struggled home or ditched at sea, but never achieved the satisfaction of watching a superfortress fall from the sky in flames. Each mission ended the same way Sasaki would land, with ammunition expended and damage to his own aircraft, and within hours the radio would report fires burning across Tokyo or Nagoya or Osaka, hundreds dead, factories destroyed, thousands left homeless. The psychological burden became unbearable for some pilots. There were incidents of pilots refusing to fly, cases of suicide among men who couldn't reconcile their warrior identity with their inability to protect their homeland, and increasing reliance on alcohol and amphetamines to manage the stress of repeated combat against impossible odds. Unit commanders tried to maintain morale through appeals to duty and honor, but these abstractions rang hollow when pilots could see with their own eyes that their claiming power. Sacrifices were achieving nothing strategically meaningful. The Americans kept coming, the bombers kept getting through, and the cities kept burning. March 1945 brought a fundamental change in American tactics that made the defensive situation even more hopeless. Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding the XXI Bomber Command, ordered his B-29 seconds to begin flying night incendiary raids against Japanese cities at low altitude. The new tactics abandoned the high-altitude precision bombing that had characterized the campaign's first months in favor of area attacks designed to burn out entire urban districts. The bombers would attack individually rather than in formation, flying at 5,000 to 8,000 feet, where Japanese fighters could reach them more easily, but where the fighters' primitive instruments and lack of radar made interception almost impossible in darkness. The night of March 9–10, 1945 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of the new approach. 34 B-29 seconds attacked Tokyo in waves, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs across a 16-square-mile area of densely packed wooden residential and light industrial structures. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 people and left 1 million homeless. Japanese night fighters made desperate attempts to intercept, but only 14 B-29 seconds were lost, a loss rate of roughly 4%, which was completely acceptable to American commanders and utterly insufficient to deter continued attacks. The shift to night tactics rendered most of Minobe's high-altitude interception innovations irrelevant. The diving attack that had shown marginal effectiveness against daytime formations was useless at night when pilots couldn't see the bombers until they were too close for a proper diving setup. Japanese fighters needed radar to effectively intercept at night, but Japan's airborne radar technology lagged years behind American and British developments. The few night fighter units equipped with primitive radar sets found that their equipment was unreliable, had limited range, and often couldn't distinguish individual bombers from ground clutter. Pilots resorted to visual searches in darkness, hoping to spot the blue exhaust flames from B-29 engines or the red glow from open bomb bay doors. Occasionally they'd stumble upon a bomber and manage an attack, but these chance encounters were too rare to constitute an effective defense. The examination of the downed B-29 back in November seemed almost quaint by March. Yoshikawa's detailed technical analysis had focused on the defensive armament system, the fire control computers, the altitude performance, all the features that made the B-29 nearly invulnerable to conventional fighter attack at 30,000 feet. But none of those defenses mattered much when the bombers attacked at night from 5,000 feet with the primary goal of burning entire neighborhoods rather than hitting specific factories. The Americans had solved the interception problem not through better defensive systems, but by changing the conditions under which they operated. If Japanese fighters couldn't effectively intercept at high altitude in daylight, then the Americans would attack at low altitude in darkness, accepting a slightly higher loss rate in exchange for massively increased destructiveness. The strategic impact was catastrophic and irreversible. Between March and August 1945, B-29, incendiary raids destroyed major portions of Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities. Japanese industrial production collapsed as factories were burned, workers killed or displaced, and transportation networks severed. The aircraft industry, already reeling from earlier precision bombing attacks, essentially ceased to function as a coherent system. Individual factories might continue producing components, but the complex web of suppliers and subcontractors needed to turn those components into finished aircraft had been shattered. By May 1945, Japanese fighter production had fallen to less than half its peak, despite desperate government directives to prioritize aircraft manufacturing above all other industrial activity. Lieutenant Yoshikawa, the engineer who'd examined the downed B-29 with such meticulous care, found himself reassigned in April 1945 to a special unit tasked with developing kamikaze weapons. The assignment reflected the complete failure of conventional defense. If fighters couldn't stop the bombers through normal combat, perhaps they could do so through suicide attacks. Yoshikawa worked on designs for rocket-powered kamikaze aircraft and explosive-laden gliders that pilots would ride directly into enemy bombers. The weapons were crude, barely controllable, and represented a complete abandonment of the technical sophistication that had characterized Japanese aviation development before the war. They were also utterly desperate acts by a military establishment that had run out of rational options. The psychological journey from Yoshikawa's careful examination of American technological superiority in November to his work on suicide weapons in April traced the arc of Japanese defeat. The examination had revealed what Japan was fighting against: an industrial system capable of producing weapons so sophisticated that they couldn't be effectively countered with existing technology. The kamikaze program represented acceptance that countering those weapons was impossible, and the only remaining option was to trade lives for minimal tactical gains that might marginally slow but could never stop the American advance. The shift from analysis to desperation had taken less than 6 months. Captain Sakai survived the war, one of the fortunate few from Japan's experienced pilot cohort to live through the final months of increasingly suicidal defensive operations. In post-war interviews, he often returned to the subject of the B-29, describing it not as a weapon that could be defeated, but as a symbol of American industrial might that had made conventional military resistance futile. The B-29 demonstrated, Sakai argued, that modern warfare was fundamentally about industrial capacity rather than warrior spirit. The bravest, most skilled pilots in the world couldn't overcome an enemy who could produce unlimited numbers of technologically superior aircraft and train unlimited numbers of competent crews to fly them. The examination of that single crashed bomber in November 1944 had shown Japanese commanders exactly what they were facing, but knowing the nature of the problem hadn't made solving it any more possible. The story of Japanese pilots examining a downed B-29 and realizing its 12.50 caliber machine guns made it untouchable isn't ultimately about defensive armament or fire control systems or any specific piece of technology. It's about the moment when military professionals understood that the war they were fighting had already been decided by factors beyond tactical excellence or personal courage. The untouchable nature of the B-29 came not from its guns, but from the industrial ecosystem that created it: the factories, the training programs, the supply chains, the research institutions, and the vast resource base that made producing hundreds of sophisticated bombers possible while simultaneously developing atomic weapons and fighting wars on multiple continents. Japanese pilots couldn't touch the B-29 formations, not because they lacked bravery or skill, but because they were trying to defeat an industrial civilization with the remnants of an already exhausted industrial base. The examination in November made that reality impossible to deny, but acknowledging the truth didn't change it. Sometimes understanding the full dimensions of a problem only clarifies why solving it is impossible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.